Hi, everybody. Okay, we're good. So, obviously, I love that quote from Richard Carney from the earlier session that if God is an infinite subject, then there's endless interpretation. We're never finished. And it just feels very hard to move on to any other subject, doesn't it, after that? But I'd like to talk a little bit about religion after religion, because I think many of us share a sense that something isn't working. And it's not just in Christianity. I'm going to talk about it in relation to the Christian religion. But if you go to Wikipedia, religion may be defined as a cultural system of designated behaviors and practices, worldviews, texts, sanctified places, prophecies, ethics, or organizations that relates humanity to supernatural, transcendental, or spiritual elements. However, there is no scholarly consensus over what precisely constitutes. You should know the word religion is, at least the word as defined here, is a relatively recent invention. Because religion and culture were so deeply intertwined, it wasn't until you started having people move into one another's cultures that you would separate religion from culture. And so our contemporary concept of religion, we still aren't sure how to define it, but it's very deeply related to just what it means to be human beings who seek meaning together in our context. And in my travels, I come across some interesting signs. That one just, it's a lovely church. It's a lovely church. It's actually in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, but somehow that dead end, going in the same direction as the church. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it's so, everybody's bashing the church. I want to talk about, in these next two sessions, something a little more positive, but I think we ought to just catalog that white, and when I say Christianity in these next two sessions, I'm primarily talking about white Christianity in America. I don't even know if there's such a thing as Christianity. I think there are Christianities. I think the difference between this form of Christianity and this form of Christianity is a smaller difference than this form of Christianity and this form of Islam, and this form of Christianity and this form of Islam. Do you see what I'm saying? So we're dealing with major abstractions here. But the demographic reality is there. Every generation in America that I've been alive, and many of us in this room have been alive, every generation we've had a retentional dropout rate that has not shown any sign of bottoming out. For generations, people who came from very conservative backgrounds like me, we felt that we were growing. And we said, we're growing because we have the truth, and you all are declining because you are heretics and apostates and all the rest. So we took great pride in that. Here's what it turns out. For what I'm about to say, I don't believe, but you'll see what I mean. You could explain 100% of mainline decline with one insight of sociology. And that insight is that when people move from one city to another, from one home to another, in another city, another location, when they move, if 100 people move, not all of them, if 100 church attenders move, not all of them will find a new church when they go to a new town. Does that make sense? You have 100 church attenders, they move once, maybe only 87 of them will find a church to go to. If those 87 move to a new town, maybe only 72. So every move, you lose a few people who can't find a new church in a new town, or for whatever other reason. Well, here's the interesting thing. Mainline Protestants sent their kids to college starting in the 1960s and 1970s. They sent their kids to college at an accelerating rate. So that means if you go to college, you leave home very often, once. And then very seldom after college do you go back to your hometown to stay. At least that's how it's been. And so what that meant is if you give mainline Protestants 2 more moves in a young person's life compared to a much lower church attendance rate of evangelicals and fundamentalists, then you could explain 100% of mainline decline. Now, don't let yourself off that easily if you're mainline Protestant. There are other reasons. You know, the music in mainline Protestant churches was scientifically designed to turn off younger people. And the architecture, you know, none of you go to a restaurant that hasn't been renovated since the 1950s, but many people are asked to go to churches that, you know, that sort of thing. So there are many, many reasons there. But this demographic decline, the tacky way to say it is that our churches are shrinking and wrinkling. And we used to think it was just the evangelicals, but then we found, or just the mainline Protestants, but now the evangelicals appear to be 30 to 35 years behind, and they're going through a similar kind of thing. Plus, the unity of evangelicalism and the religious right is driving away their young people at a growing rate. And then nobody knew about Roman Catholics because Catholics either don't keep numbers or they don't share them. But I had a Catholic sociologist teaching at a Catholic university come and talk to me once, and he said, no, I know the statistics. He said the statistics among white Roman Catholics are worse than white mainline Protestants of actual church attendance. He said, we're facing a demographic cliff in the future. So, and then, especially here in the South, I mean, when we think about what the white Christian religion has meant to the South from the period of slavery through Reconstruction, through segregation and Jim Crow, up to the present, it's just the Christian religion has not helped us deal with our racial issues. If anything, it's well, I just have this horrible. Let me say, I don't recommend what I'm about to tell you unless you are a strong person. But I read one of the most powerful books I read in my adult life a couple of years ago. It was called The Half Has Never Been Told, A History of American Slavery. And it's by a fellow named Baptist. Has anybody here read it? Can I just tell you, it is an incredibly well-written book. But it is a devastating book when you start to learn the real depths of history and how of the history of slavery, how slavery changed from the 1780s to the 1810s, and from the 1810s to the 1820s. And when you read this history in more detail, whether you live in Maryland, where I spent most of my life, where you discover that Maryland and Virginia, when they outlawed the importation of slaves from Africa, then they became slave breeding centers, where the white men, had sex slaves because the more babies that could be produced, they were more profitable than using the slaves. It was breeding and selling slaves. I mean, human beings, what that meant to mothers, what that meant to children, what that meant to fathers, it's just heartbreaking. You read about it from there to what happened in Georgia, and then what happened in Arkansas and Mississippi. And then you get to what happened in Texas, and you just find out there's way more going on in that history than any of us were ever taught. And then I imagine Sunday after Sunday, good white Southerners going to church, blithely saying, God, forgive us for our sins. Like, this emphasis on forgiveness for sins nauseates me when I think about that history. And what it perpetuated. And of course today, watching white Christians, and especially white Protestants, not just evangelicals, also mainline Protestants, in such large percentages voting for politicians that will make the lives worse of people of color. I mean, it's staggering to think that churches still haven't taught white people that people of color are their neighbors who they should love as themselves. That is a phenomenal. Look, I heard somewhere that unless you have love, it profits you. I just have to say that's a failed religion. It's failing sexually. I mean, if you think, first of all, where is the place in American culture where women are excluded from a whole set of professions? It's the only, one of the only places, and not just Christianity, but sectors of Judaism and Islam, that religion becomes the place that treats women the worst, with the least equality, is pretty striking. But then you add other sexual dimensions, like that the whole pedophilia scandal, and then you think of what it must have been like to be those bishops who were moving people around and caring more about the reputation of their organization and more about living by a lie than protecting children. I mean, that's a failed religion. And to think that the Protestants, who were doing all of their problems and not getting caught because there was no bishop to protect them, they just protected on a congregational level. And I don't want a show of hands, but I'll bet a lot of us in this room have been part of a congregation that hushed up sexual impropriety in one of its clergy. I mean, you think of that massive amount of failure by people who are claiming, we're having a problem here again, by people who are by people who are claiming moral superiority and either the infallibility of their book or the inerrancy of their book or the infallibility of their pope. You know what I'm saying? There's a failed religion. And then you think in terms of just addressing social issues. Actually, there have been a couple periods in American history where churches really rose to the occasion in dealing with some moral crises. So many of our labor laws really came out of something called the social gospel movement from the 1910s to the 1940s. And so, the fact that a lot of you are, as old as me, so you'll remember Saturday afternoon movies on television. Remember that? Every afternoon they'd play movies from the 30s, 40s, 50s on TV. And it was not uncommon, maybe you've forgotten, but it was not uncommon in movies shown on a Saturday afternoon on TV to see a man whack a woman. And it wasn't the bad guy, it was the good guy. Because it was socially acceptable. And your heroes would do that sort of thing. And the fact that you don't see those kind of shows on, they just don't play those movies anymore. It tells us that certain things have become unacceptable. I'm not saying in every area there's been failures, but you just take the treatment of the environment just as one moral issue, that things have no value apart from their monetary value. And this religion controlled the vast majority of people, or it influenced the vast majority of people, and yet it is still hard to convince people in this country that things have value, that if you look at a mountain, it has value apart from the board feet of lumber or the tons of coal. You think ecologically thank God, there are religious sectors of the church that are way, way out ahead in dealing with global warming, for example. Like, who would have known that Minnesota Lutherans would become leaders in solar energy? I don't know if you have any Lutherans here, but you should be proud, because there are Lutherans that are leading the way in solar energy in a state that's not particularly known for abundant sunshine, at least not abundant warmth. Meanwhile, my state, the Sunshine State, does everything it can to discourage solar energy. And I wish I could tell you that it was the churches that are turning the tide. It wasn't. It's the League of Women Voters that's turning the tide. And we could talk about liturgically, because whatever we've been doing in church, it has not been enough to make people think, I can't wait to get up on Sunday morning and show up, because those 60 or 75 minutes are so incredibly meaningful for me, I would never miss it. Now, there are a few churches that can say that, but so many are just boring people and certainly aren't changing them. We'll talk about that in our next session. And then failing creedally. And what I mean by that is a whole lot of people are at an event like Mountaintop Lectures because the statements that they're asked to agree with either make no sense to them or feel like they're missing the point. And so here's the irony. We're asking people to say they believe things that don't seem to matter very much, and we never ask them to say the things that really matter. So, and then we already talked about our struggles to keep up with the changing universe, to find an imaginary, a set of images to describe God that work in the world we actually live with. And then, just in terms of spiritually, I have a friend who is a Christian theologian who said to me, he has found more spiritual connection in life in yoga than he has as a theologian. You know, he just feels like I'm finding something there I've never found in my own religion. So you put all of these together, and then you have to realize this is a global problem. It's not just Christianity. As I mentioned before, I have dear friends who are Muslim leaders, and they say, look, we have very, very similar problems going on. And I have dear friends who are rabbis. And the dropout rate among young Jews for actually attending synagogue, it's staggering. And it's terrifying to Jewish leaders for all kinds of reasons you can imagine. And I was in Malaysia, and it's a majority Muslim country with a sizable Chinese Buddhist minority. And when I was in Kuala Lumpur, there's this big event at the stadium, and they were having to shut down some roads for this big event. So what's the event? They said, it's a big Buddhist youth event. They're having a Buddhist rock concert because the younger generation is losing interest in Buddhism, so they're trying to use rock and roll music to make it attractive. Gosh, we're all the same. So, but we could talk about that for ages, about what's wrong. The question is, where do we go? What is religion going to have to do? And my sense, and I'll tell you as a Christian, this is my sense with the Christian leaders I'm around, and obviously there's a whole lot who would disagree, and they just make sure I'm never invited any place near them. But it's true with my rabbi friends, my imam friends, my Sikh friends, that one of the things that's happening across our traditions is that we're moving toward either a system of beliefs or rituals to a way of life, and then we're saying we've got to define that way of life, and we've got to turn our faith communities into schools of that way of life, into communities that actually teach that way of life, that make that way of life livable and doable. The way I wrote about it in Great Spiritual Migration, which we have here, is I said we've got to reimagine our churches as schools or studios of love, so that we could, by God's grace, by power beyond ourselves, that we could make a promise to people that we could actually keep. And the promise would be, if you become part of our faith community, we will do everything we're about will help you learn how to love your neighbor, love yourself, love the earth, and in those experiences to love the greatest mystery, to love God, to love the ultimate source, to love the Spirit, to whatever language that we're going to have to struggle with, as we said before. But we're going to help you go in that direction. We won't waste your time. We will focus on this. Isn't it ironic? In the New Testament, it says, if I have faith that could move mountains, but have not love, it profits me. If I had all wisdom, all knowledge, blah, 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 it profits me nothing. And we could say, if we have buildings, if we have TV shows, if we have great programs, if we have Sunday schools, if we have summer camps, if we have rising budgets, if we have handsome clergy and beautiful clergy, and have not love, it's worthless. So here would be our chance to say, what does that mean? I wrote about this in this book, and a woman came up to me a few months after the book came out. I think I was in Denver, and she said, hey, Brian, I just have to tell you, I just got my PhD in how to teach empathy to children. And she said, it was joint degree between the education department and the psychology department. And she said, of course, you have to do a review of literature as part of your research. As far as I know, she said, I'm the first person in history to write a dissertation on how to teach empathy. Now let that sink in. Empathy is a pretty big part of love. And you realize we have learned a lot about a lot of things, but we don't know the heuristics of love. We don't know how to teach love. You know, we know in math that a 2-year-old is capable of these math concepts, and those concepts are best learned by these games and these activities. And a 3-year-old is capable of this, and a 6-year-old is capable of this, and a 9. And we know there's an order of operations that you teach counting before adding, and adding before subtracting, and so on. We know all this stuff about the learning of mathematics, but we know practically nothing about love. What it is, how to teach it, what are its component skills. And that seems to me to be, if we don't succeed at that, I don't think we succeed at anything. For this reason, I'm spending a lot of time in my life right now thinking about what does it mean to teach love and how do we teach it to children. And a lot of people are surprised. Since I wrote Great Spiritual Migration, I haven't published any books, but I have a book that's coming out next month, and it's a children's book. And I got to tell you, I feel as good about the 2,000-something words in that children's book than I do about my 80,000 words in a lot of other books. Because I just feel if we can get at the heart of some of the things that will help children learn how to love. Of course, all the adults who never learned that stuff as children, I think they're going to like it too, right? I like reading picture books. But I just think this is a place where we really have to focus. And let me just say, for a lot of folks in this room, the average age of this room, I think, is over 40. And thank God for everyone who skews the age down a little bit. But for all the older folks in this room, you might think, well, what can I do about this? I was talking about this a couple months ago, and a UCC minister came up to me afterwards. She said, I retire in a few months, and when I retire, I want to devote myself to that question. How can we develop our churches as schools of love? I think there's so much that could happen with this. But I think there's immense things that could be done with volunteer labor, like people like you. But also, my gosh, if you wanted to put up a scholarship for somebody who would study the heuristics of love, that would be absolutely amazing. I mean, really, we in this room could make a dent in this. We could really help in this area. And we find out there's a lot that's already been done, but it just hasn't been amalgamated. I remember after I wrote about this, a Catholic Christian educator came in contact with me. She said, I'm so glad to know that there's a Protestant out there who cares about this, because we've already got a bunch of Catholic educators who are thinking about this, partly because in Catholic schools they have some money to actually devote to this. I just think this is unbelievably important. But then you'd say, well, how do we bring communities together? First, I want to say, if the only thing we said is we have a community that's devoted to you becoming the most loving version of yourself possible, and we're drawing primarily from the heritage of the Christian tradition, but because we're Christians, we're open to insights from every other tradition, right? If we could make a statement like that, I think if we actually could deliver, we would have the opposite problem in many of our churches. We wouldn't have empty seats, we'd have waiting lists, because to do this well, we really have to be able to deliver. But I've been thinking also, because our churches have been defined by correctness, correct polity, correct hierarchy, correct liturgy, or correct doctrine. Like, that's pretty much it. We're correct in one of those areas. I think a lot of us are afraid if we don't have that, how will we stay together? So one way I've been talking about this is to say, and again, this is just my thoughts, but I'm offering them to be helpful. I don't think this is right, but it could be helpful in your own thinking. And I'm sorry if you can't quite see the image here. But if you think of a table needs a couple of things to be in place. And I'd start with a story. I don't, when I say a story, again, remember what I said earlier about literal versus literary. I actually think we need to try to tell some story of the universe that locates us in some way. And that, it's always provisional. It's always going to be changed. I actually think the Bible tells us that because there's one story in Genesis 1 and another story in Genesis 2. You know, there's multiple stories there to say that you can't just tell one and be done with it. But I think that we've got to tell a story about a 14.7 billion-year-old universe that starts with a singularity and starts with, and then expands, and over time, complexity and interdependence and communication and consciousness develop, and that this universe actually produces consciousness, and that we take every part of it seriously, all of the science seriously, all of the psychology, all the neurobiology, and we take seriously everything in the scriptures, and especially if we're identified as Christians, we take seriously everything about the story of Jesus, and we develop some story that we can tell. And that we can tell, not feeling like, yeah, I have to tell this stuff, but tell it because we think, actually, this is the best, most coherent story I've ever heard myself. If we had the chance to do that, it would be a telling of the story that left all kinds of room for mystery, but gave some sense of direction and trajectory to history. I think that would really be important right about now. Because as I said earlier, we don't tell a better story. There's a whole group of people who will tell racist stories, nationalist stories, consumerist stories, and so on. You might want to ask questions about this in a couple minutes. Then I think, oddly, we won't get far this time around unless we talk about saints, elders, and proteges. Now, for us, obviously, this is going to start with Jesus and Mary. We got to find our own heroes, our own central figures in our story, and start with them. I think we've got to tell. We've got to talk about Paul and James and Peter. And I know Paul. So many people are really ticked off at Paul. But let me just say, if we take off Paul the pressure of being inerrant, right? Like, that's not his fault. We put that on him. That's on us, But we allow him to be a figure in his own time. He actually is a pretty revolutionary fellow. I recently read a book by an atheist French philosopher about Paul as the source of universalism. That in a sense, Paul is a revolutionary figure because he envisions a world where there is no Jew, Greek, slave, free, male, female. It's a pretty remarkable thing to say in AD, whatever, 60-something. But then we got to go through history because Christian history has so many despicable characters. Let me not say despicable, but utterly, they'd be the kind of people we'd expect to be in Congress today. Utterly political and normal people. And if we're looking for extraordinary people who lift us to something higher, they're there in Christian history. There are many of them, but they're just sort of all thrown in with the others. And a lot of the people who have the most prestige in Christian history are the people who are best at arguing about dogma, liturgy, and polity, hierarchy. But what about the people who actually did stuff that, served people? And so who are those people? My friend Diana Butler Bass has done a wonderful job at this. She wrote a book called People's History of Christianity, right? I think that's the title. And it does a great job of that. But who will our saints and elders be? If you've never seen the dome, I forgot, what's the church word for dome? Anyhow. I can't remember the word I'm looking for. But at St. Gregory of Nyssa Episcopal Church in San Francisco, just look up St. Gregory of Nyssa, San Francisco, and you'll get to their website. And is it nave? Anyway, the dome has 10-foot tall iconic figures painted around the dome. And St. Gregory of Nyssa decided, who do we want our special saints to be? So obviously Jesus is leading and they're painted around the dome, and they're dancing, like holding hands and kicking their heels up. And of course Jesus is leading the dance, which I think is great. But like Charles Darwin is in there, looking, he's a lovable person, but he looks tired and old because he went through a lot in his life. And anyway, you'll see all kinds of amazing people. But what that does is it helps us root ourselves in a tradition. We're not saying all those other people are horrible. We're saying these are the people that we emulate. And here's what we emulate about Charles Darwin. And here's what we emulate about Lady Godiva is on the list. And then the elders are people who are alive now. Who are the people that we really see as important leaders now? And to me, one great thing about this is if Presbyterians were to hold up, some Pentecostal and some Episcopal and maybe even a Methodist leader, and vice versa, that would do us a whole lot of good. And then proteges, who are the young leaders that are emerging who we think, pay attention to these people. They have something to say. We start with a story. We embody that in people. Then from that, we also talk about practices. And this is where we have to I think we have to start from scratch, and we have to say, what are the practices that help people become loving? And don't do it if it doesn't help people become a more loving person for neighbor, self, earth, and God. What are those practices? A lot of what that will mean, again, to quote my friend Dana Butler-Bass, it will mean retraditioning some of our practices. For example, the Eucharist. Obviously, I think the Eucharist is a central practice that we should hold on to, but I think we've got to lose almost all of the old language that a lot of our liturgies contain that present the Eucharist as evoking Jesus, using Jesus' blood to keep God from killing the rest of us. And I think that those meanings are utterly unhelpful and even dangerous right now. How would we articulate the meaning of the Eucharist? There's a book coming out on this next year. I just read the manuscript, and I'm drawing a blank on the author. But keep your eyes open because it's the first coherent, deep, coherent book, really dealing with the issue of what meaning do we want to identify with that practice. I wrote a book called "Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Muhammad Cross the Road?" And in that book, I wanted to talk about doctrines that have been used to kill people and practices that I think are used to create a sense of superiority of us and inferiority of them. And I knew I would have to deal with the issue of baptism because the practice of baptism can be used to say we're among the clean now. This baby is clean, or this young person is clean. What does that mean about everybody else? And if you know anything about the history of religious violence and genocide, it always begins by making other people dirty. And so then to kill them is cleansing the earth from them. And if you just have that in mind, you think, wow, baptism, maybe that's not one we keep. But I remember when I wrote that book, I knew I was going to have to deal with that. I just started rethinking and doing a lot of reading on baptism. Here's the irony. You go in the New Testament and you find a chapter where Paul goes and meets with a fellow named Cornelius. And what does he say when he encounters? And there's this whole thing with a dream. And I'm sorry, not Paul, Peter. And Peter is invited to eat non-kosher foods, which you understand, eating those dirty foods that those dirty people eat. And before Peter baptizes Cornelius and his family, he says, wow, God has now shown me I should never call anyone unclean. So isn't it interesting? What if you were to imagine baptism as being cleansed from any temptation to call people unclean? Like, I sort of get that, That kind of makes sense. And anyhow, much more we could say about that. That's practice. And then vision of the future. What is our desired future? And this is one of the most important. I'm going to come back to this in the next session. But what is our vision of the future? What is the kind of world that we envision? Now look, I have all kinds of friends. I'm not against people owning guns and all the rest. But you've got to ask. It looks like a lot of people in our country think that the more guns we have, the safer we will be. That there is no limit to the number of weapons that we'll have, both personal weapons and national weapons. And of course, yeah, is that our vision? Do we have a vision of a safe future that doesn't involve everyone having more and more catastrophic weapons? If we better articulate it, because you understand, if you tell people we're going to take away your guns, they think you envision a more dangerous world for me. We've got to give people a compelling vision of a way to have a safer world. We certainly need a way to have a more sustainable world. And that articulation of that vision, it's one of the things the world most desperately needs, and it shows up nowhere, virtually nowhere in our traditional liturgies, except as an evacuation plan when the world is hopeless. And we'll all go to heaven and everything will be fine. And so this vision, this direction is really important. And that's really the last thing I want to say, and then we'll have some time for questions. Because I think when we talk about a vision and a mission, a way to achieve a desired future or move toward a desired future, the word for that is movement. And the good news is, I think we have amazing people alive and working and speaking today. Even these are just people in the United States. Well, Desmond Tutu isn't in the United States, but people known well in the United States. And with the exception of Desmond, these are all people that I know. And so just think how many people I don't know. And just amazing, amazing, wonderful people, all different denominations, Catholic, Protestant, just in the Christian community. And you think these people are articulating a kind of shared vision. And I think this is very, very possible. I wrote about this in the book to say that I think we're in the midst of a migration from organized religion to organizing religion, from an institutional religion. Now, I'm a big believer in institutions, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. From institutional religion to movement religion. And that discipleship it means forming people to be spiritual activists, taking people who are part of the problem, helping them become disciples of the way of Christ, the way of love, so that they can be sent out as apostles. I think apostles are spiritual activists in this sense, to be doing God's work in the world. And just a quick theology of institutions, movements, and communities. And I use these two images because, in recent memory, we've had a time when a movement succeeded in influencing an institution. Now, we had major failures after that. We'll maybe talk about that. But first, let me define a community. This is from Wendell Berry, as a group of families, individuals, organizations linked to a common environment, collaborating for the common good. Much more we could say about that. But the fact that we share an environment, that's going to be community. By the way, I just had an experience this week. I have to be careful what I say here, but in the town where I live, this quirky little town in Florida, we've had a big scandal going on among our police department, where a bunch of police officers have been fired for all kinds of sexual activity on the job. But we also know there's racial profiling, and there's all kinds of trouble in our police department. We have there's two ministers in our town who have had a little bit of the cover lifted on the corruption, and for some reason they called me and said, "We need to talk. Could we talk about this?" And what they realized as we talked is no minister in our town has ever seen the police department as a part of their ministry. You understand? My ministry is just my little flock. Nobody feels responsibility for the parish. And now for them to get involved, it's like they're redefining what it means to be Christians and ministers in this town. To say, hey, if the police are hurting people, that's my business. I need to get involved in that. And how do I leverage my leadership? That's what we're talking about in a community. You're all connected to each other. institutions or organizations which can serve the gains made by past social movements to serve communities. And so the institution of medicine preserves decades and centuries of learnings of people, people who died, we learned something from what didn't work in helping them. People who lived, we learned something. Those are amazing gains that we preserve through institutions. Accountants, we learn to steal money in new ways. Accountants have to figure out how to catch us. And you preserve that over time. And then they come up with brand new ways to scam you and steal your identity. And accountants have to keep getting to work. That's new methods are the movements, and then the institutions preserve them. And then the institutions make proposals or demands to current institutions to make progress toward new gains. I should say toward institutions and communities. And that's where I think we really, in hindsight, messed up after Dr. King. Because once we had civil rights legislation, we had affected the institutions. But that's when the Presbyterian Church and the United Methodist Church and the Roman Catholic Church should have said, do we believe this is right? Do we have courage? Then we have to go and we have to get our white congregations, having members of our white congregations having dinner in the homes of their Black and Latino and Asian and Native American neighbors. We got to get people together. We have to build communities of connection. But we didn't do that. We just passed the legislation, and now we're finding out it's not really fixed until you build the community. And I'll tell you, it's one of the reasons I can't give up on the church, because there's nobody in the United States at this point who, if they got a mind to, could start making that happen, like our churches could. Just give you an example. I've got a friend. He grew up like a fundamentalist like me, and he went on his own journey. And he was Pentecostal, and he was sitting in a fast food restaurant one day. And any of you are, you don't have to be Pentecostal for this to happen, but if you're Pentecostal, you're not unaccustomed to hearing God talk to you. And it happens, And so Jeff is sitting in this fast food restaurant. I think he was reading his Bible or something and drinking a Coke. And he hears this voice in his head say, Jeff, you're a bigot. And he says, what, Lord? You're a bigot. And he says, my daddy was a bigot, but he's only thinking about white-black bigotry. And it feels like the Holy Spirit saying to him, you hate Muslims. He says, you're right, I hate Muslims. and he said, if that's going to change, you're going to have to change my heart, because I really don't like Muslims. Of course, he didn't know any Muslims. He just watched the news that told him to hate Muslims. So he's my friend. I'm just telling you what he told me happened to him. He makes that prayer, and a little boy climbs up in the seat across from him in those little booths with a seat, climbs up in the seat. And the boy sits down, puts a piece of paper out, takes out a pencil and starts drawing right across from him in this Burger King or something. And he thinks, where's this kid's mother? And he looks across, and there's a woman in a hijab sitting in a chair. He thinks, okay, I'm ready. And in the years since, here's what he did. Because he was Pentecostal, he didn't wait for a committee. He said, I got a problem. I hate Muslims. This is my problem. So you know what he did? Literally, I'm not kidding. He drove over to the nearest mosque, knocked on the door, said to the imam, I'm a charismatic pastor, and I have a deep prejudice against Muslims, and I really need help. And they became friends. And his journey's continued, and he lives in one of the towns in North Carolina that was devastated, Wilmington, that was devastated by the hurricane. And he's become welcomed into an Episcopal church because he found out that the other churches didn't like Christians who liked Muslims. So his Episcopal church and the mosque have formed a relationship to help rebuild homes. So they're rebuilding homes together, and they're helping each other after the hurricane. So that's movement stuff, you see. That's stuff that does something out in the world. Look, movements and institutions are organized. They need each other. They get frustrated with each other. They can either harm communities or benefit communities. Institutions need movements to stay fresh, and And if movements don't have institutions to carry on their tradition, they have to form institutions that usually makes them worthless as a movement, which is fine. Then just another movement has to come along to challenge them once they're an institution to make new gains. And usually they're so tired from the first ones they resist. But let me just skip ahead here. So we need movements and institutions. And we have to recognize that movements can be progressive or regressive. One way to understand our lifetime is that in the post-war era, a progressive movement happened in the United States. I mean, think about it. In the 20 years after World War II, there was a new surge of the feminist movement. There was a new surge of an environmental movement. There was the civil rights movement. There was this whole convergence of, and there were others that we could mention quickly too. Rights for disabled people or diversely abled people. I mean, all kinds of interesting movements happened. And anti-war movement, my gosh. And some spiritual leaders signed on to those movements. And a lot of what's mainline decline, in my opinion, came especially when Protestant ministers said that Dr. King was right about race and about Vietnam. And I think a lot of people, when they felt that their ministers were not backing America, but were prophetically confronting America, they looked around and thought, where could I go that would not challenge prophetically my country? And there was another whole group of people who said, we'll do that. We'll be that for you. And this was all part of Nixon's Southernization strategy and a whole lot of other things. But then what happened is there was if I can say it this way, a regressive movement that said, we don't like these progressive changes. I didn't mention LGBT equality, pretty important one, with strong beginnings, in the 60s, that late 50s and 60s, that then got more momentum a few decades in. But you just think all of those progressive movements started to make progress, and then another group of people said, we liked the world better before all this. We made more money when we didn't have to worry about polluting the streams. We liked this when we didn't have to, when we had people we could look down on, even if we were poor and white. We felt better when we could look down on somebody else and make jokes about them and we didn't have to worry about our language about other people. And, and it's totally understandable. And there were people who were willing to lead that movement in that direction. And guess what? That's life. There's always going to be movements. And if we don't have a attractive and constructive and creative movement at this time, who draw inspiration from some of our great progressive movement leaders in the past, then we will in a sense, it will be a failure of all of us, not a failure of somebody else. One last thing I'll share, and then we'll open up for questions, is I got interested in all this movement stuff, and I tell the story in the book, but I got stranded in Bujumbura, Burundi, East Africa, in a hotel with no air conditioning, and the door didn't lock. It's the two things I remember about that hotel. And I was stranded there for a couple days, and wouldn't you know it, in the hotel was probably the world's leading thinker on Christian ecclesiology and movement theory. And so all I had to do was buy a few beers, and I got all of his dissertation explained to me in person. His name was Greg Leffel. He's brilliant. And Greg spent that weekend where I was stranded teaching me what he had spent years and years studying. But basically, if you think of a movement, it's born when three things happen. Two or more people agree on what's wrong. They agree what should be done, and they agree to do it. Now, with that little definition of a movement in mind, I want you to hear something from the Gospels. Wherever two or three of you are gathered in my name. What does that mean? Well, that phrase, can I tell you, help me understand that phrase? It was Jennifer Lawrence, that great theologian. But I saw something somewhere. It said, Jennifer Lawrence, under the name Katniss Everdeen. And I realized, yeah, in my name means playing my part, playing my role. Yeah, do you see the difference between that and putting the word Christian on something? No, wherever two or three of you are gathered together, acting me, acting Jesus, acting Jesusly, if you want to say it that way, playing my part, embodying my way, embodying my spirit. That's the beginning of a movement. And so then Greg had studied all kinds of social movements through history and said there were 6 characteristics. And this looks horribly intimidating when you're asleep in the middle of the afternoon. So rather than explain them in theory, what happened is I was with Greg in East Africa. I had 2 miserably long flights home. And this was back in the days when I still carried an actual physical Bible. Now I would have, I just have it on my phone. So I never have the pages, the physical version. But I had one. And so I was sitting in my, airplane seat with my little tray table down and a Bible. And I just start taking notes, looking for his 6 characteristics of social movements. And it was like a spiritual experience at 39,000 feet. Opportunity structure says this: movements never succeed when the elites are unchallenged. And the only time a movement can succeed is when the elites experience a fracture. And something happens to weaken the elites, and that opens a structure, an opportunity in the social architecture for a movement to happen. And then you just have that in mind, and you think, yeah, the elites of the Pharisees and the Sadducees are at each other's throats. And the Herodians and the Zealots are at each other's throats. And the struggling masses in Galilee and Judea are at a boiling point because they're being oppressed by the economic elites down in Judea. And so here's this opening for a movement to happen. By the way, we think that Jesus would have, as a boy, grown up just a few miles from Sepphoris, where there was a military rebellion, where several thousand men were crucified for rebellion. Imagine a boy growing up with that memory from your own neighborhood. That sure doesn't work. That's not the way to do this. And then you imagine a really brilliant, look, I know it's not creedal to say Jesus was brilliant, but I read a lot of literature. This dude is brilliant. Whatever comes through there comes through as political and spiritual brilliance. And he grows up and sees, hey, if those elites are ever conflicted, here's an opportunity for something different to happen, a nonviolent movement to happen. And then rhetorical framing is, what is your basic message? And he comes up with this amazing message, the kingdom or commonwealth of God, this image of life to the full, life of the ages, which is, by the way, remember what I said about salvation before? Stick in the word liberation. Be real careful when you come across the term eternal life in the Bible, because we always think that means life in heaven after you die. But I don't think that's a good understanding. I think life of the ages is life in contrast to life in this present evil age, as Paul puts it. And it's life, it's a higher kind of life. In our context, we might say life that transcends the current partisanship, or life that transcends, it's on a higher level. So he has all these ways of articulating his message, and he always articulates it in dynamic tension with tradition. You have heard it said. Then he doesn't say, but they're wrong. He says, but I say to you. Do you see what that is? Here's the tradition. I'm not just going to critique it. I'm going to give you an alternative to the tradition. Amazing rhetorical framing. Then next is a messaging strategy, protest strategy. How do you get your message out? And so think about public demonstrations. Obviously, Jesus drew big crowds. Now, whether or not you believe these things literally happen, imagine telling this story. How does Hitler, Hitler did too, how does Caesar get power? Caesar gets power by threatening to kill and torture people. How does Jesus build his movement? by healing sick people and giving them food. Pretty obvious. We're dealing with a parody, a guerrilla theater of the powers that be. Civil disobedience, turning over the tables, guerrilla theater, exorcisms. I mean, you can't think of a better way to dramatize we've been invaded by a hostile power that's making us behave in horrible ways than the image of a person who we used to know was fine, and now something's happened. They've gone wrong. And naming of woes and festivals, big, I mean, whatever you think happened at the feeding of the 5,000, it sounds a lot like Woodstock. And not only that, it sounds a lot like free education. Because when you think that poor people couldn't afford education, and when Jesus spends day after day, 3 years of doing, you might think of it as a campaign stop, but it's a little more than that. It's actually education. It's quality, free education provided for people. When I was working on this, I couldn't help but remember a book that I read in a college in the 70s, and some of you might help me because I can't remember the title. But it was a story of a communist, a young communist. He'd been a factory worker in Europe somewhere, and somebody came up to him at his factory and said, "You know why our lives are so miserable, don't you?" And he said, "No." And the guy said, "Yeah, there's a theory that explains why our lives are so miserable." And he introduces them to Marxism. And this guy was a factory worker, not highly educated, but he gives them some pamphlets to read and gives them a newspaper to read, and he gets an education in economics. Now look, you might not like Marxism at all, but you can imagine nobody else is offering this factory worker a free education that explains the mess he's in. And then not only that, but they invite him to become a teacher and first start giving him free papers to hand out to others, to talk to others about what he's already learned. And he just presented it as, and he had, by the way, since left communism and become Roman Catholic. He wrote this as a Catholic. But he basically was saying as a Catholic, the church could learn a lot from Marxism that I used to be part of, because it was working as a movement and teaching people things relevant to their actual situation. Then Jesus develops a mobilization strategy with 3, 12, 70, the multitudes. He's pushing authority outward constantly. My friend Doug Padgett is writing a book right now called Greater Than, and it's a reflection on that verse in John that Jesus really shouldn't have said, according to Christianity. You will do greater things than I do. What could he possibly mean by that? And that's not the way someone with a messianic complex behaves. They have to do it all. But it says, no, this is in your hands. You're going to do this. And then he creates a movement culture. There's a vibe to what Jesus is about that feels very different. There's fun and surprise and wit and humor and sarcasm and all kinds of stuff. But it creates this whole vibe of people. And then he provides his disciples with things that change their life, participant biographies, so that they have stories to tell. And they remember that time we got beat up. Remember that time we got thrown in jail. Remember that time they threw stuff at us. Remember when that guy said that about us. And remember when we went away for that time in the mountains. Remember when we showed up at that university and spent a day together. And suddenly they have stories and memories to tell. And it just makes me say, what if a spiritual movement is trying to be born among us today? What demands and proposals would it be making? To whom would they be addressed? And where would we all fit in that movement? I just want to close by telling you a quick story about this, because I need to say this again. I'm not against institutions. In the end, anything that lasts longer than a generation is an institution. I'm against institutionalism. That's when the institution has either forgotten or betrayed its purpose, or it's become the purpose just to keep the institution going. But so I think these last few years we've witnessed an amazing moment. And I'm going to tell you a little behind-the-scenes information. So Pope Francis, 2 years ago, put out something called Laudato Si. How many of you read Laudato Si or part of it? Okay, so I think It's the most important theological document maybe since the 95 Theses. I hope it is. Time will tell. Right now it doesn't look so great. But it was an amazing moment when the Pope of the leader of the Roman Catholic Church writes a letter not to all Catholics, but to all human beings on this planet. And he basically says we have to open our ears to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. A phrase he repeats several times that has a rich Catholic tradition, including a Brazilian liberation theologian named Leonardo Boff, who wrote a book called Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, and was silenced by the previous pope. Get the irony? Yeah. But I think this document is precious. I think it's intelligent. I think it's not perfect, but I think it's really important. But a couple of months before the document was released, a friend of mine, who's a lay Catholic Franciscan activist, gets invited to come to the Vatican. And on the flight, he sees somebody he recognizes. He didn't know her, but he recognized her. She is a Jewish, Canadian, atheist, socialist activist. And he goes up and says, "Hi, I've read some of your books and blah, blah, blah." And he says, "Where are you going?" She says, "You'll never believe it. I'm going to the Vatican." They found out they're both going to the same meeting with the Pope. And so they somehow sit on the plane together, and she's saying, "Why would the Pope want me? I'm an atheist. I'm super pro-choice. I don't know why I'm being invited, but you get invited to the Vatican, you can't say no." And so they get to the Vatican, and it's a relatively small meeting, and Pope Francis meets with these people, and he says, "I have a document coming out in a couple months. It's going to be called Laudato Si. We're asking all the people of the world to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And I've invited you here because you're people who already have heard that cry, and you're already working on these issues." And then he says, "When my document comes out, many of my bishops will oppose me. So I've called you here asking for your help." Well, this Canadian socialist, atheist, activist says, "Excuse me, but I'm Jewish and I'm an atheist." And he says, "I need your help too." She says, "I'm pro-life, I'm pro-choice." He says, "I know that. I need your help too." And I thought to myself, at that moment, Pope Francis is not acting like an institutional leader alone. He was also acting like a movement leader. Do you see what I'm saying? And what he said has come true. He came out with this document. He traveled around the United States. Days after he left, several bishops repudiated his document. And so he's seeing how his institution, I know this is hard to imagine, but his religious institution has become captive to wealthy donors. Only in Catholicism. Another friend, Catholic activist, one of the foremost anti-nuclear weapons activists in the world. Guess where he decided to live? In New Mexico, near Los Alamos, where it has a history and a current practice of researching nuclear weapons. And so he spent a couple of years in jail from protests that he's been engaged with, and that has been his base of operations. I know it's hard to believe, but the leaders of his order called him in and said, "We're sorry, we have to ask you to leave the state of New Mexico." And he understood why. Wealthy donors put pressure on the bishops, and the bishops put pressure on his order. Can you understand why institutions are very susceptible to control by donors? And that's why movements of, I know it's hard to imagine governments, political parties. I know it's hard to imagine. But can you see why movements have to arise that use a different currency? The currency of passion, the currency of anger, the currency of vision, the currency of solidarity, empathy, love. And what if what Jesus was really about wasn't he wasn't like lying awake at night thinking, I can't wait for there to be multi-million-dollar buildings and huge endowments. I can't wait for there to be bishops with so much to protect that they'll sweep pedophilia under the rug. I can't imagine Jesus lying awake at night thinking that. I think whatever Jesus was about, he must have been thinking, we could get some people together who care for the poor and hear the cries of the earth, a whole lot like Pope Francis. And brothers and sisters, all the raw materials for that kind of movement are within reach. Another way that Jesus said that is the kingdom of God is at hand. It could be there if we seize it. Amen? So we have some time for questions. And why don't we institute the girl, boy rule? Or yes, we got somebody right here.
Wow.
Yes. Oh, not yet. Yeah, there you go.
All right. I'm totally inspired by your description.
Could maybe is the mic on? Okay. Okay. I think he's getting it for us now. Good.
Does this work better? Hello?
Not quite.
I'll scream.
That's good.
I'm totally taken by your description of a movement that would have as a main goal to be a school of love and a way to practice that love towards ourselves and others. Because in essence, that's what Jesus was all about. So I asked you during break, we are in a northern Georgia area, which I'm sure I don't have to explain that it is definitely very traditional, fundamental, nothing wrong with that. People feel safe in that environment, and that's okay. However, I think there are many of us who would like to have a place to go, so to speak, where we could say there is this progressive thinking where we can have, as those who lead the movement,
Yes.
to have that message rather than the very traditional message that if you go out of that institution, then you're a non-believer.
Yes.
So I didn't know if you knew of any such movement. I know there are many, many churches in our North Georgia, I mean, definitely. But I don't know of any movement that is like that, and that was my question.
Yeah.
Do
So,
you know of any starting that way?
Yes. So I'm going to guess that you'd like to say something about that.
Well, there's a couple things. One, this thing we talked about this morning about the Friends of Mountaintop Lectures that we're going to be putting on the website will be those types of areas where you can go. I happen to go to a Seekers class that we drive 1 hour one way to get there every Sunday morning. Would not miss it. And it's a kind of environment, a safe space where we have great discussions and you grow. The other thing is, I think there are going to be a number of things. We have a Roadhouse project that we do on the third Saturday of every month. And we use YouTubes online. And so we've had Brian and Greta, and we've had all kinds of different speakers that we get together. We have some Mexican food, some margarita, and we have a conversation. So I think you're seeing more and more of that, and hopefully Mountaintop Lectures can be kind of the catalyst or a seedbed for that type thing. So I think there's an opportunity.
I think there is. And so really this is where it suddenly becomes real movement stuff, where everyone in the room suddenly says, well, I guess it's up to us. What are we going to do? The great news is, I'll just tell you, I get to travel a lot. Probably Diana, who I mentioned, and I get to speak to more Protestant clergy than just about anybody in the country. And I will tell you, at all levels of our denominational structures, we've got people who will do everything they can to open the doors for this. Many of them have to be careful, but they can open doors. There are certain places where there are congregations that are really embodying this. Many cases, there's not many. And some places I know in the country, you'd have to drive 3 or 4 hours. You know, if you just took, I want to find a church where my gay son would be welcome, you'd have to drive 3 or 4 or 5 hours in some places. So it's not like it's everywhere. But it's changing, and it's not as fast as it needs to, as fast as I would like to. And none of us know how it's going to turn out. But I think there are places. But where it usually starts is exactly what's happened here. It starts with somebody hosting a party where a bunch of people can come out together. Parker Palmer calls this divided no more. What he means by this is a whole lot of people are in our churches and they hear somebody up front say something and they think, oh crap, I don't believe that. I can't believe he's saying that. I ought to just get up and walk out. But they get used to not walking out. And so they live divided. What I think and what I look like I think are in very different places. He says all it takes is one person who feels divided and says, divided no more. And they say, you know what I think? And they speak out. As soon as one person speaks out, he says the next step is what he calls communities of convergence. People say, he just said what I've been thinking. I'm going to go talk to him. Now the movement has two. Well, it actually is not a movement yet. It's what social theorists call a critical conversation. And my guess is that's going to be a critical moment for a group like Mountaintop, if you don't mind me just making an observation. Critical conversations are important. They often go on for over a century before a movement happens. Because a whole lot of work has to be done to bring about, a lot of intellectual work has to be done. A lot of excavating has to be done. A lot of sifting through. My friend Phyllis Tickle used to say, there's like a rummage sale. You got to decide, what are we going to put out at the curb and what are we going to keep? What's a treasure? What can be trashed, right? So that's critical conversation. But when a few people say, we've actually got to do something. Here's our vision of the future. Here's what we're going to do to help bring that about. Then you move to the next stage where communities of convergence are actually working as a movement. You know what he says the next step is? The next step is, he calls it alternative rewards. Because if more people start speaking out, they will be punished. They'll be fired. They'll be relieved from their duties in the Sunday school class, But enough will grow, and they'll find other ways to keep going. And then he says you've got the makings of a movement. I'll just say, where that can happen institutionally, I think we should take advantage of it. If somebody opens a door, you have a class, take advantage of it. Then I think I need to say two other things about that, though, before we move on. The second thing I would say is if there's not an opportunity, it only takes two or three gathering together. I hope you have that idea of what it means to be in Jesus' name, playing the part of Jesus, being part of his movement. In a sense, you're being a movement organizer. And it's my fault. It's my fault. That's the thing that tells me I just am talking too long. But then, that's perfect too, because the last thing I was going to say is that we've got to find a way for older white folks to be the wind beneath the wings of younger and people of color folks, because it's obvious that they're going to be the leaders of this, like nobody else. But the amount of support that a group of people like this could offer. I'll just give you one quick image, and we'll move to the next question. But so I live in Southwest Florida, a place a lot like North Georgia. And when the March for Our Lives happened, you remember the high school students from Parkland called for a march. Of course, I was going to be there. And I know the activist community in Southwest Florida, and I thought, if we get 200 people, that'll be good. If we get 400, that'll be amazing. And my dream, if we could have 800 people, it would blow my mind. So I arrived early, and the plan was we're going to meet in this park, and then we were going to mark, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I guess 10 blocks. We're going to march 10 blocks and come back for a rally. So I look around, and people are coming, people are coming, people are coming. The march begins, and people had made it around the 10 blocks and are coming in, and I still hadn't left the park. And so finally the organizer said, it's time for the rally. Don't march, just come to the rally. And then the rally was led by high school students. They weren't from Parkland, they were the local high school students who had found each other through social media, and I'm not being falsely humble when I say this. 3 high school students gave speeches better than I have ever given and that I have ever heard. I heard 3 of the best speeches I've ever heard in my life. And look, we got horrible stuff going on in our world. But man, we get behind people like those guys and things could really happen, you know, and with wisdom and support and encouragement and partnership and all the rest. Yeah, so that's what I would say. Let's go. Thanks for that question, though. Oh, I'll just say, I wrote a book called We Make the Road by Walking, and if you needed a curriculum for 1 year of gatherings, that book it gives you everything you need. So I hope it could be helpful.
Good.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I wonder if you see any risks in the contemporary fervor for something dazzling and dynamically new. How much of that might be a reflection of today's imagery of a world that's disposable, you know, shiny new trinket comes out every 4 months. Like,
Yeah.
It seems that represents where we are in more than just systems failing, but applying our desires for newness
Yeah.
to something that's not sustainable. And so if you do see a risk there, I hope that maybe in the next session you could talk a little bit about institutions that are willing to do transition
Yeah.
and the movement from one place to another without starting over.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first, what your first name again? I forgot. Adam. The fact you would ask that question would tell me that you probably see some danger in it, as do I. So the first thing I'd say is good for you for having the courage to and the insight to mention that. I'll say 2 kinds of that danger that I see from my current experience. One is there is, just like in conservative settings, there's the more conservative than thou group where everybody races to the right because the only way you gain more credibility is by being more extreme than the other person, and you want to be able to name them as not being as extreme as you, right? So you're the true believer kind of a thing. We see that happening there. There is the more liberal than thou or more progressive than thou, where the shortcut to being noticed is to be more extreme. So that's one danger I see. It's very relevant to that. And then you see a whole lot of people who just want to burn stuff down, and they don't care what they lose. And so this is something I haven't emphasized a lot today, but we'll come to a little bit in this next session. But the treasures that we have in our traditions and let me use the language I used before, in our communities and in our institutions. Those treasures are so great. And right now, our institutions are functioning so badly in relation to the change going on in our world. It may be impossible to imagine them doing really great. But that it's going to be very tempting for people to trash everything, to just throw it all out. I'll give you a quick example. So when I left the pastorate in 2006. This guy started coming to my church, and I never met him when he was there, but about 10 months later, I was back at the church I'd pastored. They asked me to come back or something. And this guy comes up to me. He says, yeah, I really wanted to meet you. I always heard you preach, but I never really met you while you were here. He said, I just wanted to thank you. He said, the reason I came here is because of your next door neighbor. And I said, who do you mean? He told me her name. Now I'm confused because she is a Reconstructionist Jew. And if you don't know what Jewish Reconstruction is, in a way, it's an atheist form of Judaism, but in light of the Holocaust, is very serious about maintaining the tradition. And in a sense, it's a group of Jewish intellectuals who said, how do we be true to our tradition when some of our fundamental beliefs have been discredited or made incredible by what's happened? It's a powerful story of people, and amazing people in that community. So he said, I'm part of her synagogue. He said, but I went to her one day and I said, I feel like something's really missing like, I actually believe in God, and I'm not allowed to say that at our synagogue. And he said, I pray, and I just wish I could find a place where I could just be honest about the fact that I do think there's something there. And so my next door neighbor said, oh, you should go to this church down the road. Because they're not into who's in and who's out and blah, blah, blah. But they're like really spiritual. And so he started coming and had been coming for that 10 months plus, since I'd been away. He says, yeah, I come here every week. I cry. I don't know what it is. I just feel the Spirit of God, and it's just made my life so much better. He says, I guess I should convert. I said, don't you dare. Please don't do that. I said, look, if you really want to. But I said, look, everything we have is yours. You can have anything you want from us. You can be here as much as you want. But you don't have to cut off what you've been to gain what we are trying to offer you. Now, I was thinking that I responded that way quite intensely, partly because I just felt like the Spirit in me was rising up to say, please don't consider this a zero-sum game, but partly because I knew that my neighbor would kill me if you did that. I said, whatever you gain here, use it wherever you go. But that's the problem. We're very often, people are ready to cut off the past, and there's problems with that on 100 levels. So, thanks so much for that question. I think it's really important. I think we have time for one more. Right here. It's good. Thanks.
I just wanted to say that when you were talking about we need schools to teach love, that the first thing really that came to me was Dr. Fred Craddock. And in this area, a lot of people, know him.
Yes.
And when he retired from the ministry, and from teaching in seminaries, he started the Craddock Center to give services to, this little part of Appalachia. But his main thrust is to intervene in the lives of preschool, Head Start children by bringing in people from the neighborhoods, who have the same culture, to do visual, music, all of this, and it's in numerous counties now. But they're teaching love, and it's not labeled, any
Yes.
denomination.
Yes. And it's targeted at preschool kids.
It is totally targeted, and it's been going for a number of years very successfully. But children who come and who, storytelling is a big thing. But children who have come who have not spoken yet.
Yes.
Do their first speaking in some of
Amazing.
the art classes, the storytelling, the music. So I think that's one of the good examples.
I really do too. Let me just say, if a curriculum like that got developed, now I know a lot of churches represented by folks here probably have a lot of older folks and don't have too many children. You could see that as a problem, but you could also see it if you have a congregation with 40 or 50 adults who don't need another church service necessarily. You know what I mean? Like, you can survive missing a sermon. But you're available to learn a curriculum so that congregation could say to all the young families in the area, hey, we've got something we think could help your family, and if you want to bring your kids, this could be a good thing. That's a pretty exciting opportunity. I'm just so intrigued by this. Just this week I was emailing, I don't want to get into all details, but with something about politics. And Bernie Sanders was a topic of conversation in this email. And this economist said to me, I'm a big fan of Bernie's ideology, but he said he's got one really big problem. He wants to spend money on free college education. And he said, if you're going to spend money, the place to spend it, this is proven without a shadow of a doubt, is on preschool and early childhood. That's where you make the biggest effect on people's lives. We know that. Now, he says, I'm all for college, But, you know, Bernie's forgot how important kids are. And just so interesting that was Fred's instinct. Can you see, with that in mind, why in the Gospels there's a story about mothers wanting to bring their children to Jesus, and the disciples say, send them away? Now, every time I've ever heard that preached on, the punchline is, isn't Jesus wonderful? He loves children. That's true. But might the story be, don't you be idiots like the disciples and forget how important children are? The children are really, really important. If you're movement building, children are really, really, really important. They're important in any way. So that's great.